All right, welcome to the inaugural episode of Slimehouse, an only podcast looking at the film genre not super commonly known as Slimehouse. I'm Jasper Birnbaum.
I'm Nelson.
I'm Max Morris.
I'm Jared.
And I am Sam.
So to start off, we've named this podcast Slimehouse, but I don't know if a lot of people know exactly what that might mean. So let's dive in. Maybe Max, the coiner of the term Slimehouse, if you want to describe how you kind of came to that term.
Yeah, so the birth of Slimehouse, it actually started, I was in high school in a video production class, and at the beginning of the class, we all kind of got off into little groups, and I went with two of my friends, and the teacher was going around asking, what's your favorite type of movie? And just to mess with them, we had just made up the genre name Slimehouse, like on the spot, obviously sort of based on Grindhouse. And the teacher said, what are some examples of movies like that? And on the spot, we thought of Good Burger and the Eddie Murphy Haunted Mansion movie. We just sort of laughed about it and moved on. And then later we were explaining that situation at the lunch table, and one of my friends was like, wait, that's like really funny. Like those with Slimehouse, could that like actually be a thing? And we sort of organically went into this game of naming movies and saying whether or not they were Slimehouse. For me, it's always just kind of, I've looked at them like sort of exploitation movies targeted towards children because they're sort of share a lot of similarities with what are commonly known as exploitation movies, because they're all like very low budget for the most part, sometimes not, but usually pretty low budget, usually a select group of like themes, very like niche genres sort of all to themselves, for the target of like making money, which I mean most movies are at one point, but sort of that's the primary goal of Slimehouse.
This is kind of a genre that I've always been infatuated with, starting as a young kid and actually enjoying a lot of these movies. So it was so fun to like see, you know, when I kind of stumbled upon your list on Letterboxd, an immediate name that just like rings true. It's such a term for this like group of children's movies. And it's not any children's movie, I think, but this specific era of just kind of in your face, super saturated, bright, goofy, slapstick children's comedies.
Yeah, I think your point about the children's movie distinction is really important, because I think growing up there was a sense of we all grew up in sort of the 90s to 2000s transition, and we were all movie people at that point, and there was a sense of what a kids movie was, and there was a clear sense of what that felt like versus a grown-up movie that only with the benefit of hindsight and perhaps some more sophisticated movies that would see later that were targeted at children, that it became clear to me that kids movies didn't have to involve, you know, the bad guys getting sprayed with fish guts or something like that. I thought that was just part of the recipe for a kids movie, and suddenly that, as an older person, realized that this was a hyper-specific type of kids movie that for our age seemed like every kids movie was that way. It sort of begs the question, why were kids movies all like this at that time?
My story finding out the name Slimehouse was that I was talking with Nelson and we were laughing about like movies that we liked when we were kids, and I think I mentioned that I was like, oh yeah, back when every kids movie seemed to have one self-contained scene of people repeatedly farting. That was the point of the scene. And he laughed and goes, yeah, you know there's a name for that. Slimehouse. Let me send you this Letterboxd List. And that was like a real eye-opener for me, because, you know, thinking of the self-contained fart scene I was like, oh, of course, you know, the original live-action Scooby-Doo and, you know, the Steve Martin Pink Panther. But then seeing all of them in one place and being like, oh, there's a whole world of these movies that we just accepted as fact when we were kids. And I think it's a very specific genre that might have some contention for some of us as well, because I think they're slime elements that get inserted into movies that, you know, may otherwise not necessarily be considered Slimehouse movies as well.
Like Slumdog Millionaire has a Slimehouse moment for sure.
When he drops down the toilet.
Oh, yeah, there you go. And on that tip that Sam's talking about, you know, I think that we define them at first as these mid-90s to mid-thousands children's movies, but I think kind of as the first genre, as a film fan growing up, that I saw consistently and watched consistently, most of us digested those tropes and at such a formative age. I think now you can go back and see like, oh my God, this didn't just start in 1996. There's movies that all the way up to 1980 and even beyond that, you can't deny that there is a lineage of film history that has led to these movies and has spawned afterwards.
And one thing that we were talking about is maybe putting some limits on what kinds of movies can be considered Slimehouse, because I think we're talking a lot of the examples that we're going to be covering first are major studio movies. And as Max said, they're kind of cheap for major studio movies. But when I think of these movies that we're talking about, a lot of them have this sheen to them that's very commercial. It's a very commercialized aesthetic. I do think there are some fully animated movies that are Slimehouse. Like, I think one that we talk about a lot is Boss Baby and some of the DreamWorks ones. I noticed a lot of movies that are on this Letterboxd list, they're either live action or more likely they're a synthesis of live action animation. And I think this is something that has its roots in the 80s, but really rose to prominence in the 90s when people started combining kind of animated worlds with live action worlds. You got your Space Jam, you got Flubber, Osmosis Jones, Page Master. When I think of a Slimehouse movie, I think of something that kind of combines those two worlds, the real and the formal.
Yeah, I really like that because I remember in the early, when we were first making the list, me and my friends, there was actually discussion over whether any animated movies qualified for Slimehouse. From the beginning in our heads, that like marriage between early CGI and live action was very essential to like the understanding. And we did decide, of course, some animated movies are, such as Boss Baby. There might be one of the Shrek movies on there, although not all the Shrek movies, and I'm not sure why, but maybe we can get into that. Especially the early CGI kind of aesthetic with live actors is very crucial to the aesthetic, the way Slimehouse looks.
One way that I've kind of described it to a lot of people is Slimehouse kind of feels like you're watching a live action cartoon. Like it's the spirit of a cartoon, that slapstick kind of zany nature, a lot of, kooky characters that wouldn't actually exist in the real world are created in a lot of these movies. That, bounces back the marriage of literal cartoons and live action and like Looney Tunes back in action, things like that. And kind of like the Scooby-Doo example, just very crude. I mean, the Scooby-Doo actually looked quite good. A lot of these movies are actually live-action adaptations of cartoons. Like, you look at Scooby-Doo, you look at Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, Inspector Gadget. A lot of these were ways, in the same way that a lot of the Disney movies being made now are live-action adaptations of successful animated movies from the 90s. A lot of these were, live-action adaptations of cartoons that were successful in the 70s and 60s when our parents were growing up.
And the remake thing is a really good point because certainly there are a lot of the list that are a remake, but if we look at the Disney remakes now, they do have a certain tone and color palette to them. They're meant to be very real, and whereas in the 90s, the remakes, including Flubber, which is our first one, were not interested in trying to make a gritty reboot or a grounded remake.
Yeah, from what I've seen of The Absent-Minded Professor, Flubber certainly doesn't try to ground that movie at all. If anything, it really ups the cartooniness and the wackiness of the original, which I think it's sort of the opposite of what you're seeing now with a lot of remakes. They're not trying to ground these zany things. They were sort of making more grounded things even wackier.
And that's a really good point. It was okay, these special effects, this kind of humor was really in 1961 was new at the time. So how do we revolutionize that technology nowadays with this new technology of CGI, and how do we just make this like the most colorful, absurd thing in the world?
To your guys' point about the zaniness and the fun quotient, I've mentioned this, I mentioned Slimehouse to a few people, and I've been like, kids movies that have kind of crude humor, and they're like, oh, like, kids movies that have stuff for adults too. And I'm like, no, that I think is the key difference as to like what's different about the new Disney remakes is those aren't kids movies. Those are legitimately movies for everyone, or movies with stuff for adults. Adults don't want to see Max Keeble's big move. This isn't for everyone, and I think that it's this like commercialized punk that they thought thought kids wanted.
It's really tapping into the id of a child. Yeah. I mean, like in
Yeah.
PG movies, you get the reason for the rating is like thematic elements. I think that's a good way to like differentiate like a Slimehouse movie that exclusively for kids and a Pixar movie like Finding Nemo that has like taps into what you were saying about there being story and themes that are resonant with adult audiences.
Well, the rating thing is really important to me, and that was a recent aha, was that with the birth of PG-13 as a rating in the late 80s, suddenly create their own trademark stamp. To our parents' era, PG movies, kind of the 4-quadrant movies. And nowadays, it's funny, I'm tutoring these kids in film, and they watch Marvel movies. That's what they like, and they kind of go straight to PG-13 in a way, even though they're younger than 13. These are big budget movies, so they have to appeal to every single person out there.
That's ultimately it. I think that's the key distinction on Slimehouse is intended audience. You know, that's what makes current Disney movies feel PG-13. Is that, I mean, I have my own theory that I don't even think that most of these Disney movies are for kids anymore. I think it's for the same people who liked the originals and are now our age, which is a key difference. Whereas I don't think that this Flubber was for the same people who liked the original Flubber.
I think it's like a very interesting, whether intentional or not, marketing strategy to say, oh, we're going to update this movie that your mom saw as a kid, so she'll be interested enough and be, oh, Flubber, that's based on The Absent-Minded Professor. Sure, I'll go take you to see that. So I feel like it's a way, it's that cycle of remakes that happens every 20, 30 years. How do we get parents to spend money at the theaters?
Our mom growing up liked movies a lot, and she would take us to movies, but we'd say like, oh, we want to see this movie, See Spot Run. It looks so funny. And my mom would always be like, let me see if a babysitter can take you to that one. And that's how, in a weird way, I knew it was Slimehouse, was that if it was a babysitter movie, it was probably Slimehouse. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of just that whole, like, flattening of mass popular culture. Like, everything's made for everybody. I feel like Marvel's a good example of that, for example. Like, everything is made for everybody to go see. Instead of, like superhero movies are made for people who are into superheroes, then, like, animated movies are for kids.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Like
that now, I don't think that PG-13 was a 4-quadrant movie in the late 90s, and I think it certainly was by the 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, growing up, PG-13 to me was like the Adam Sandler movies of the world, that kind of, the Will Ferrell movies of the world, the stuff that, you know, my parents were actually, they weren't strict about ratings, but they were pretty cautious. Like the stuff that I would have to watch at a sleepover. You know, crude comedy that had, you know, a couple of swear words and probably some dick jokes, you know.
Well, it was kind of for a teenager, too.
Yeah,
like,
and it was
those
for
were
a
actually
teenager.
made for teenagers.
The humor that at the time you think is cool, you know. So when you're 13, you're like, oh, yeah, like Adam Sandler makes cool jokes.
But when you're 6... Robin Williams slays the jokes in Flubber.
And that's a little introduction to Slimehouse for you all. Come back every week for a new film, some of which we already mentioned on this show.
Including Flubber, which we will be covering on our first episode.
We'll be digging deep, digging back, and really honing in on defining this Slimehouse aesthetic. All right, see you next week.